Good afternoon. It is Friday. It is almost 5 o'clock. It's been an incredibly busy week, but I just wanted to hop on and share a few thoughts. Um, my name is Brian Almon. I write at gemstate.substack.com, so go check it out there. I'll try to have some new pieces out soon. I am still working on the remaining parts of the Great Reset series from earlier this summer, but things keep happening. Elections and campaigns and special sessions and children's drag shows in Boise. That's been occupying a lot of attention this week as conservatives in the Treasure Valley, as well as throughout the country, are mobilizing to make our voices heard regarding these events. And we've had some success. We've gotten a lot of sponsors to pull out, and that is good, and we should keep up the pressure. The event itself is starting today and will go through Sunday, September 11th. What a way to celebrate, eh? What a way to remember that day that has become so important in our country's history. I will most likely be there to report both for Gemstate, Substack, as well as Idaho Freedom Foundation. My piece on that has been going around for a while. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to talk to Steph Lucas on the radio out KID News Radio out east, and that was a good time. If I ever find a podcast link to that, I'll post it. But for now, I want to put all that aside, all that unpleasantness, and talk about the legacy of the Queen. Queen Elizabeth II obviously passed away yesterday at the age of 96. She'd been on the throne for 70 years. Which is an incredible feat of longevity. Now, first you might ask, why should an American care about the British royal family? After all, didn't we fight a war to win the right to not care about that? And to an extent, that's true. However, the British monarchy it's representative of tradition, and it's a tradition that we are a part of. Americans and Brits, we are cousins, sundered by an ocean and several centuries of growing apart. However, we come from the same common heritage. Our ancestors are their ancestors. If you're, an American whose family has been here since the Revolution, it's likely that you have, distant cousins over in Great Britain. I have some third cousins in Wales that I've been able to get to know through, studying genealogy. My ancestors were Englishmen and Scots and Irish, and so the history of Britain is my own family's history, just the same as the history of America. Winston Churchill, the former prime minister, he was also an historian and author himself, and he wrote the 4-volume history of the English-speaking people. In fact, it's right behind my head up here. It's a great little paperback set that I got from Barnes & Noble many years ago and really enjoyed reading. I should go back and read them again. Churchill starts his history with the creation of England when the Angles and the Saxons first crossed the water and settled in Britain and pushed the native Celts away, unfortunately for them. But they created the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Wessex and Essex and Sussex and Kent and Northumbria, Mercia, and they created a unique culture there. And so Churchill takes their story and moves through England, medieval period, the Renaissance era, and then in the Age of Discovery, when colonizers and pioneers are going throughout the world, he splits the story. He talks about America and talks about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. He goes and talks about Canada and Australia and India and, traces the development of the English-speaking people as a unique culture and how they established themselves throughout the world. And so, caring about the English royal family, the British royal family, is, I think, something that people who are students of Western history end up doing, because it is a part of history. It's a part of living history. It's an institution that goes back 1,500 years. The current monarch, now King Charles III, is a descendant of those same kings who ruled in the first millennium, in the second millennium. You go back to King Alfred the Great, who's the King of Wessex, whose kingdom was so besieged by the Vikings, by the Danes, that at one point he and his last group of soldiers were hiding out, and he was staying over at a house. And the woman of the house asked him, not knowing he was the king, asked him to watch the cakes that she was cooking, and he was distracted by the thoughts of the fact that he was on the verge of losing his kingdom, that he let them get burned, and she chastised him. He went on to reconquer much of England from the Danes, and eventually, by the time of Edward the Confessor in the 11th century, England was once again a united kingdom. And then, of course, you had the conquest of William of Normandy, and all of English history since then. But it's the same line. It's the same unbroken thread of history going all the way back. And that is what is important about someone like, Queen Elizabeth, because she was up until yesterday, a living reminder of that history, of that heritage. And that is what, in the 21st century, I think a monarchy is supposed to do. In the United States, we have a natural aversion to the very idea of a hereditary monarchy. But, looking at our current system of government, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. I mean, the grass is always greener on the other side. But nevertheless, as an institution of Western civilization, I think it's something to at least admire from afar. The person of Queen Elizabeth herself was also an institution. I remember visiting Ireland about 10 years ago, and I was staying in a hostel at Drogheda. And the only person working there was the hostel keeper, the person who was going to stay there that night. And he and I got to conversing about politics and culture. I was telling him what was going on in the United States. He was telling me what was going on in Ireland. And he downed an entire bottle of wine during this conversation. And that was amusing. But he explained that he hated the British. And it's understandable. If people in old cultures have long memories. And England was not kind to Ireland over the years. They invaded them, 3 times, 4 times? You had the long history of the Troubles. And so he was not fans of the English. And he was especially not fans of the English royal family because, they represent what, the dark side of that same tradition that I was just talking about. And from the perspective of someone in Ireland, I can see why he would feel that way. He told me that he was especially annoyed that Prince William wore an Irish Guards uniform for his wedding. He felt that was, that should not have been done. However, even though he had those strong feelings, he still could not find it in himself to dislike the Queen. He had positive feelings for her personally. And I think that's the case with a lot of people. See, Queen Elizabeth has been around a long time, or had been, until yesterday. She grew up in the 1930s. She watched as her uncle abdicated the throne to go marry an American woman who had been divorced, which was beyond the pale for somebody who was supposed to be the supreme governor of the Church of England someday. And so because of that, she was thrust into a position she was not born into. When she was born, she was the daughter of a duke and the niece of the Prince of Wales. But then once her uncle abdicated, that put her in the position of becoming the heir to the throne. And it's a position that she took seriously. I mean, she was, as everybody knows, she was working for her country in the war. Obviously not fighting on the front lines, but she was a mechanic working on automobiles, keeping them up and running so that they could be used in the fighting. And in her 21st birthday speech, she famously said that no matter how long or short her life is, she pledges to devote it to the service of her people. And that's a promise she kept from that day until the day she died. 2 days before she died, she was still carrying out her constitutional duty of appointing the new prime minister. And that's just an amazing legacy. Most people do a job from age 18 until you retire, 60 or 65 or whatever. But here she was, age of 96, still doing everything that she had been doing her entire life. And that's, when you think of a king or a queen, I mean, especially Americans with our natural built-in antipathy for monarchy, we think of somebody just sitting around living in luxury, somebody who never has to want for anything. They've got servants to take care of them. They get to do whatever they want. But the reality is kind of the opposite of that. Somebody in the position of the queen is put in, kind of put in a box where the entire world is watching everything you do, and you have certain duties that you have to perform, and you have to maintain, basically a perfect life. Obviously, her sister and her children all had various scandals and difficulties with marriages and relationships, but she herself kept herself, kept away from any scandal. And that's an impressive achievement, especially when you're on the throne and in the public eye for 70 years. And literally in the public eye. I mean, kings and queens in the past, they had scandals, but this is the television age and now the age of the internet. You can't hide anything anymore. President Kennedy famously had all sorts of affairs, but the press decided it was none of their business, and they made sure that that was not communicated to the American people. Obviously, in the day and age of Gary Hart and Bill Clinton, that is no longer the case. The press sees it as their job to dig up as many dirty secrets of celebrities and politicians and leaders as they can. But nevertheless, Elizabeth was, her coronation in 1953 was the first coronation of a British monarch to be televised. And it'll be interesting to see what the next coronation looks like, because it hasn't happened in so long. The fact that TV has been around since the 1950s, and yet there's only been one British coronation that's ever been televised, that's just a testament to her longevity. She became queen when Winston Churchill was Prime Minister of Great Britain. He obviously had been born in the 1800s. He had been born in the reign of Queen Victoria. He had fought in the Boer Wars in South Africa. He was the first Sea Lord during World War I, and obviously Prime Minister during World War II, and then Prime Minister again in the 1950s. When Elizabeth became queen, Harry Truman was the President of the United States. During her reign, she saw 15 British prime ministers and 14 American presidents. Her reign encompassed literally 1/3 of the history of the United States of America. And that's why, just as a person, as opposed to the monarchy itself, Elizabeth was an institution in and of herself. There are men and women who were born after she was already queen, who grew up, went through their entire careers, retired, and they're sitting at home in their rocking chairs with grandchildren on their knees, who never knew anyone but Elizabeth as the monarch. I was watching one of the streams yesterday as the British news were covering the event, and the broadcaster for ITV 3 times in 10 seconds accidentally said, "His Majesty the Queen." It's a lot to get used to when you're an Englishman and you've grown up your entire life with Her Majesty the Queen, God Save the Queen, Her Majesty's ships. All of those things being just, something that rolls off your tongue. Switching it around now is got to be difficult. It reminded me of when the year 2000 came around and we all had to start learning how to write the date as, whatever 2000 instead of 19 something something. It's a habit that's really hard to break because it's just been there for so long. And again, a testament to her longevity. And the fact that she was not connected to any scandals was so important to that. From the day she, first entered public life to the day she died, she remained one of the most admired people in the world by people on all sides of politics. And that's one of the unique things about the United Kingdom as opposed to the United States, that, Here, our head of state and our head of government are the same person. Technically, Joe Biden is president. He is the head of government in that he is the chief executive, that he leads the executive branch, that he has these roles to play, these constitutional roles to play in carrying out the functions of our government. Now, we all know he's, senile and addled and someone else is pulling the strings, but officially, that's the way it works. But he's also the head of state. He receives foreign diplomats. He goes on tours around the world and meets with other foreign leaders. He does the state dinners. He, gives people the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It's really two roles in one. In Britain, and this is something I didn't really understand until I was older. It's not something I read in a textbook. The head of state and the head of government are different people. So the head of state is the king or the queen. As the head of state, Queen Elizabeth's duties included going on tours of the world, visiting foreign leaders, attending state dinners. She also granted the honors of the British Empire or the British Commonwealth, member of British Empire, and knights and ladies, including the members of the Order of the Garter, which is the only British noble title to be conferred directly by the sovereign. It's her own choice or his own choice now who gets to have those honors. Whereas the head of government of the United Kingdom is the prime minister. And so the prime minister does the constitutional roles of, carrying out the law and, trying to change the law in the parliament and all those things, appointing the cabinet ministers. And so from an American perspective, it's really weird to have those two things separate. But that is why somebody like the Queen could be so popular with people on both sides, because her role was not political. She rarely waded into politics, taking one side or the other. Officially, she supports whatever the current party in power supports. So when, Boris Johnson or Liz Truss now are the prime ministers and the Conservatives have the majority in parliament, the Queen and now the King support their agenda. And when the Queen would go and open Parliament with her speech from the throne, the speech was basically written by the Prime Minister and his or her staff, because it was establishing what the priorities of the new government are. However, back when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, it was the same thing. She supported Labour's government. And while that might be frustrating, that's also what made it possible for her to stay so admired by everybody. There is a sense, though, it's interesting. Most of the reactions to her passing that I see online are, sorrow and, recognizing the momentousness of this moment in history, and the integrity, the personal integrity of the Queen herself. But there are two negative reactions I'm seeing. From the left, it's good riddance, that colonizer is gone, which is ironic because she was actually a decolonizer. The British Empire was officially ended when she, before she was queen. Her father was the last British monarch to have the imperial title, because India was granted independence during his reign. And so there was, the empire was dissolved and it was reformed as the Commonwealth. And countries have joined the Commonwealth since then, and they've left the Commonwealth because it's a kind of a voluntary union where each of the nations of the Commonwealth have the Queen as their head of state. However, they have their own governments, their own parliaments, their own prime ministers or presidents, their own laws, their own customs, but they are united as kind of in a brotherhood. And it's kind of a cool thing. I remember when I was visiting Australia back in 2002, that was during when the Commonwealth Games were held in Australia. And so got to watch on TV as the Queen came and opened the games and did all the ceremonial stuff, and they played their sports. And it was kind of like an Olympics, but just for the Commonwealth. It was fun. So it's ironic that leftists are calling her a colonizer and saying good riddance, because she presided over the dismantling of the British Empire, which you'd think they would be happy about. But really, what's really in their hearts is just hatred. Hatred for white people, hatred for Europeans, hatred for the British, hatred for Christians. And it's hatred and envy And they're just expressing that because they know that it's going to get them attention for being so crass and so ugly in a time when so many people are mourning. Now, the other negative reaction I'm seeing is from the right, from people to the far right, kind of more where I hang out. And they look at her as a failure because she did not stop the British slide into decadence. Britain is going through the same thing that America is going through, in some ways better, in some ways worse, where unchecked immigration is changing the demographics and the culture. The church has gone completely astray. Technically, the monarch of Britain is the supreme governor of the Church of England, yet now the Church of England is not standing on solid theological ground anymore. Britain itself, you have all these issues, the scandal where Muslim rape gangs were going after English girls in Rotherham and other cities, and it was covered up because for fear of racism. Police will come and arrest you if you say the wrong thing online. You're not allowed to have guns. You can't defend yourself. So there are tons of problems with Britain. And so people on the right who criticize the Queen, they say that she should have done something to stop this. And maybe that's true. I don't know. Maybe she could have, maybe she couldn't have. Technically the monarch, the king or queen, still exercises specific authority. They can, even if Parliament passes a law, the queen, or now the king, could still reject it. It hasn't happened in a while, and who knows what would happen if they tried. If, say, the Parliament passes some ridiculous law and the new king decides it's not in a country's best interests and refuses royal assent, it might cause a constitutional crisis. There are voices in Britain who would like to see the monarchy gone. They want to abolish the monarchy, get rid of the royal family. They say they're just a tax drain, that they're just people living off of the wealth of others, and there's no reason to have them anymore. So that might provoke more of that reaction. It's interesting that technically the king or queen appoints the prime minister. It's not an automatic thing that the leader of the majority party just becomes prime minister. The last time a king tried to intervene and go against the will of the people was almost 200 years ago. It was King William IV, who came just before Queen Victoria. The people elected one of the parties, I don't even remember who it was, and he refused to allow the leader of that party to form a government. He rejected him. And so it went back to the people for another election, and they elected the same person. And so the king gave in, because what can you do? What are you supposed to do? Go pick somebody else who will have no ability to govern because every member of parliament says, no, you can't do this, so we're not going to cooperate? It really does kind of show you the limits of monarchical power, even hundreds of years ago. You go back 1,000 years, and the king had to worry about the people rising up in rebellion, and that happened several times. Consider King John. His barons revolted against him and forced him to sign Magna Carta, which guaranteed certain rights to the people that the king could not infringe. Richard II mismanaged his rule, and his cousin Henry of Bolingbroke rebelled against him and became the new king. You had the Wars of the Roses, where you had two families fighting over the throne. You had the English Civil War, where King Charles I tried to rule without Parliament. His cousins in France were doing the same thing, and they were doing just fine, King Louis XIV. So he figured, why not just rule myself? Just rule myself and my council. I don't need Parliament. And eventually, the people in Parliament got so frustrated that it started a civil war, and the king lost his head. Just a generation later, King James II was wanting to convert England back to being Catholic, and that really frustrated the Protestant lords, and so they invited his nephew and son-in-law, William of Orange, to come in and become the new king, and James fled, and it started a series of civil wars, the Jacobite rebellions. Jacob is Latin for James. He himself tried to raised an army in France and tried to come back and take back his throne, but he was defeated in Ireland at the Battle of the Boyne. His son came back in 1715 and tried to retake his throne. He failed as well. And then his grandson, Bonnie Prince Charlie, invaded in 1745, and had actually taken Edinburgh. And Prince Charlie made it more of a cultural thing. Instead of just being Catholic against Protestant, he appealed to the cultural heritage of the Highland Scots. And so it became more of a Scots against English sort of thing, although there were still Scots who were loyal to King George at that point. He was finally defeated at Culloden in 1746, which, by the way, was the last time there was a battle fought on English soil. So the last time England actually had a battle in England was before the United States was even a country. That tells you how old they are. But yeah, so the kings in the past had to worry about, if they mismanaged the country, people would rebel against them. And eventually it got to the point where, you didn't have rebellion so much, but you had political rebellions, like the case with King William IV. And that's how the monarchy got pushed into this almost ceremonial position, because the people made their will known through Parliament, through the House of Commons. And so really, how much power does the current king now have? Can he go against the will of the people, or does he just have the ability to use his voice to nudge people in a certain direction? Now, Queen Elizabeth obviously didn't use that ability, what Theodore Roosevelt called the bully pulpit with the American presidency. And perhaps that's why she remained so admired, because she's tried to stay above the fray. Now, will King Charles III, do the same thing, or will he want to push, nudge people toward his own ideas? Some people are worried about what those ideas might be, considering that he has been an active member of the World Economic Forum. He's talked about building back better. He seems to be fully on board with the environmentalist agenda. But there's also other things that, perhaps other ideas he might have that may be better than that. We'll just have to see. Obviously, he's not going to be on the throne for long. It's going to be a situation like when Edward VII succeeded Queen Victoria. By the time he took his job, he was already an old man. And so he was only on the throne for 8 years. And then his son took over. It's going to be the case here. We're not going to have King Charles around for as long as we had Queen Elizabeth. So we're going to have a coronation, and Charles will be king, or he is king. Today, in his address to the nation, he said that he has already created his son as the new Prince of Wales. And so William is now the heir to the throne. So within about 10 years, I'd say Charles is going to be gone and William will be king. And at that point, who knows what England will look like? Will the people still believe in having a monarchy? Will people still want to support this? Will they see the value in having a royal family? Or will they want to just get rid of it and be a republic like America, have an elected head of state? I think if they did that, maybe it makes sense in the short term, maybe it makes sense in practical terms, but I think something of ineffable value to Western civilization would be lost. And I think something has been lost. I think Elizabeth was the last link to a bygone era. I remember doing a stream a year and a half ago when her husband, Prince Philip, died, and I said basically the same thing. He was the last link to an old era. The generation that fought World War II is almost gone. And with their passing, I think we're left just a little more adrift as a culture, as Western civilization. I got this in the mail the other day. This is a magazine out of the United Kingdom. It's a conservative nationalist magazine. My friend Raheem Kassam had the opportunity to guest edit this one, and so he reached out to me and several other people that he knew to contribute. And so I'm really stoked to see my name there with such luminaries as Ned Ryan and Jack Posobiec and Terry Schilling. And I was really stoked when I got it and found that my piece was the very first one in here. I took the opportunity, this was just after our Independence Day, so I took the opportunity to write about what I called the common thread between English and American nationalism. And I won't read the whole thing. You can go to ukmallard.com. It's only like $7. You can have them ship you a copy. It's very, very cool. But I wrote about how English history and American history, as I said in the beginning of the stream, is really one and the same. We are the same people. We're cousins across the ocean. I wrote about John Adams, our second president, who said, quote, "The liberty, the unalienable, indefeasible rights of man, the honor and dignity of human nature, the grandeur and glory of the public, and the universal happiness of individuals were never so skillfully and successfully consulted as in that most excellent monument of human art, the common law of England." End quote. Nearly 2 centuries later, Winston Churchill, after meeting with President Roosevelt before America entered World War II, but after Britain was involved in the war, observed, quote, "When I looked upon that densely packed congregation of fighting men of the same language, of the same faith, of the same fundamental laws, of the same ideals, it swept across me that here was the only hope, but also the sure hope of saving the world from measureless degradation." End quote. For Churchill, it was actually personal. His mother was American, and so he was actually a natural-born American citizen. He could have come to America and become a president, but he went to Britain and became a prime minister. So when he wrote the 4-volume History of the English-Speaking Peoples, he did have a personal stake in it, because he can look back to his own past and see, his ancestor was the Duke of Marlborough, who fought the French in the War of the Spanish Succession and defeated them in several glorious battles, and also was one of the people who was instrumental in ousting King James and bringing about the Glorious Revolution. But then he can look to his mother's family and look back to American patriots. I wrote in here, tens of millions of Americans set their alarms to wake up early in 2011 to watch the wedding between Prince William and Kate Middleton. On the other hand, one of the most enduring moments following the 9/11 terror attacks in 2001 was when the Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace played the Star-Spangled Banner, a song originally written in defiance of a British attack on American soil. The people of Britain and the people of the United States are, we are the same people. And so our history is their history, and their history is our history. And in my piece there, I wrote that American and British nationalists are united in the same battle as well, against the same forces of globalism. And so what happens here affects them, and what happens there affects us. And so I think it is entirely proper for the American people to have a respect for the royal family, even though we kicked them out of our country 250 years ago. Once that war was over, once we'd fixed all of our disagreements with the British, it was only natural that we became fast friends. As one of the founding fathers said, I forget if it was John Adams or Benjamin Franklin, I think it was Adams, that we could have been a great and free peoples together. And we ended up being so. We joined each other in World War I to fight the Kaiser. We joined each other in World War II to fight Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. And we've had a special relationship with the United Kingdom ever since. And so I think it's entirely understandable that for millions of Americans, the death of Queen Elizabeth affects us. It is the passing of an era, not only for Britain, not only for the royal family and the Commonwealth, but for Western civilization as a whole. And from a big picture historical perspective, it's a little bit poetic that the first Elizabethan era marked the entry of Great Britain into the stage of world powers. Britain at the start of Elizabeth's reign was bankrupt and weak. They had been, had their own interior battles, between the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation under King Edward VI, and the Counter-Reformation under Queen Mary, Bloody Mary. And when Elizabeth came to the throne, she was faced with rebellions. She was faced with invasion from without as the Spanish Armada came to bring Catholicism back to England. Her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, was implicated in a plot to overthrow her. But when she ended, what's fascinating is that Elizabeth had no children. And the nearest heir was the King of Scotland. England and Scotland had fought each other over and over and over and over from the days of William Wallace and King Edward I, to the battles of Flodden Field. Um, they had always been cantankerous toward each other. But when Queen Elizabeth I died, they peacefully handed the crown to King James of Scotland, and he became King James VI of Scotland and King James I of England, uniting the crowns. And the two countries would be united for until the present day, despite the best efforts of Nicola Sturgeon. So the first Elizabethan era saw the ascendance of Great Britain as a world power. Coming into the 1600s, they would be one of the most powerful colonial empires on Earth. The British Navy became the most feared fighting force on Earth. And, it came to the point where the sun never sets on the British Empire. The second Elizabethan era, which ended yesterday, was the bookend to the first. Elizabeth II saw the dismantling of the British Empire, the stepping back of Great Britain from the world stage. And they came out of World War II kind of shell-shocked. And they made a conscious choice to withdraw from many parts of the world. India became independent, and now is the countries of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. They lost their holdings in the Middle East as Egypt became independent, as well as the other Middle Eastern nations. And today the empire survives in the Commonwealth, but it's entirely voluntary. King Charles is now the head of state of Canada and of Australia and New Zealand and several other small countries, but it's almost entirely ceremonial. In fact, it was Charles himself, as Prince of Wales in 1997, who presided over the handing back of Hong Kong to China. And of course, just over the last 2 years, we've seen that the Chinese Communist Party has asserted itself in Hong Kong, taking away the autonomy and special rights that place was supposed to have kept after the handover. But that's the rise and fall of empires. And as I said, it is poetic that the rise and fall of England was bookended by the first Elizabethan era in the beginning, and now the second Elizabethan era in the end. Time will only tell what happens next, but for now, I think it's entirely reasonable to reflect on the legacy of Queen Elizabeth as a person and as a representative of an entire culture, the personification of her people. As a person, she gave herself to service, and she should be honored for that. As an institution, the monarchy is our connection to the past. It's a reminder of our own ancestors and what came before. So I appreciate your indulgence in listening to me wax on about these things, just something that I have an interest in and I find important. So I will get back to normal local politics tomorrow, especially as these events in Boise continue, and I will report on them and keep you updated. Until then, have a good Friday evening. Have a good weekend. May God bless you all.